Reading gauge and garter stitch is also simple, except you just have to know what stitch you're counting. So in the knit stitch, we're reading the V's, okay? In the garter stitch, you're going to read either the frowns or the smiles, but don't read both. And what I mean by that is if you look at the ridge of a garter stitch, I'll stretch this out a little bit so you can see it. Each ridge is made up of a smile and a frown, a smile and a frown. You don't want to read both, you read just one or the other. So here I am going to line my 0 up with the side of this. I'm going to read the frowns, okay? And again, I tend to cover it over as I count it just to be sure that I don't lose my place. So I've marked the 0 up against the edge of this first frown, and now I'm going to count just the frowns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So I've got 13. I only read over 3 inches because this is a smaller swatch, which I didn't do for gauge purposes, but I'm using it just for the illustration here. So I have 13 stitches over 3 inches, so 13 divided by 3 will give me my gauge. It's always important to read gauge over some multiple of inches. You never want to read over just 1 inch and take that for granted, because you can have some variation within a row of how you're knitting in your tension. So it's better to read over 3 or 4 inches and divide that number by 3 or 4 to obtain your gauge. And when reading gauge over a pattern stitch, such as one that includes cables, it can be trickier to read your gauge, but it's equally important. And so I usually knit up a swatch, again block it just as you do for stockinette or garter stitch, and then what I do to read gauge is, in this case my pattern is, the pattern over which I need to read my gauge is 2 purl, 4 for a cable, 2 purl, 4 for a cable, 2 purl. So you can see I have only 2 extra stitches on this little swatch here, my edge stitches, because I don't like to read my edge stitches. But I'm going to want to read the size of my gauge for these 8, 12, 14, 16 stitches. So I have 16 stitches. I'm going to lay my straight edge down. You don't want to stretch your design out, but you do want to block it. So once you've blocked it, you're just going to lay it flat on the table, place your 0 right up against the edge of the stitch which defines one side of your pattern, and read across to the stitch of the other side of your pattern, in this case this purl 2, and so my gauge here is 2 3/4 inches for those 16 stitches. So what I'm doing is, instead of trying to count, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because it can be difficult to count the stitches in a cable where they twist on top of each other. So instead of trying to actually count them across in a row, I identify the stitches on my needle, so I keep them live, I don't bind off, and then I measure the area covered by that particular pattern repeat. So the stitches I'm reading off the needle, and what I'm doing on to read the gauge is looking at how many inches those 16 stitches take up once I have knit enough fabric, because you can see, like at the bottom of this where I first cast on, it looked like those 16 stitches were going to be a much wider gauge, but once you do the cables pull in a lot, and so they're always going to have a much tighter gauge. So you've got to get away from the cast on edge, do several repeats of your pattern, and then measure your gauge this way. So reading for a lace pattern, the same idea as the cable. You want to do an entire repeat, however many number of stitches that is in your lace pattern, and I'll do a swatch with that number of stitches plus 2 edge stitches at least. Sometimes I'll do 3 or 4 edge stitches. The point is I don't want to read my edge stitches, so I will cast on an entire repeat of the pattern. I'll knit the entire pattern up, and then I'm going to read, in this case, because the lace doesn't pull in so much, I do actually bind off and again steam set my swatch, but then I'll lay my straight edge or ruler down so that the 0 is next to the first stitch of the pattern repeat, so I ignore this edge stitch, and I measure the distance across to this last edge stitch, so that is 4 3/4 inches. So 29 stitches into 4 3/4 inches gives me my repeat, or gives me my gauge.